Okay, everyone, welcome to this month's Making Mitigation Work webinar series. Thank you so much for joining us. We're really thrilled that you're here today and are very excited about the presentations to follow. My name is Lori Peak, and I serve as the director of the Natural Hazard Center here at the University of Colorado Boulder. It is my honor to welcome you to today's webinar series, and just a few logistical items before we dive into today's webinar. Move this forward. So first, do please know that this webinar is being recorded and that the captioned recording as well as the presentation slides from today's presenters will be posted on our Natural Hazard Center website at hazards.colorado.edu. And this is also where you can find more than 20 webinar recordings that have been posted as part of this Making Mitigation Work webinar series. And so we hope that you will visit the Natural Hazard Center website to take a look at the past recordings as well as to visit there for today's recording. And as always, we hope that you will share the information. We also want to remind our participants today that thanks to a partnership with the International Association of Emergency Managers, that this webinar will lead to you earning up to 1 contact hour towards your emergency management training certification if you are seeking that out. And so the only requirement is that you do need to be here for the webinar for the duration. And if you fulfill that, please reach out to Katie Murphy, and you can see the email address on the screen. It's also on our website. It's hazcenter, HAZCTR at colorado.edu to receive your certificate of attendance for today, so you can move forward with that certification. And as always, many thanks to IAEM for the partnership that makes this possible. We also wanted to make sure and encourage our webinar participants today. If you have questions or comments that you want to share throughout the webinar, we're going to have about 40 minutes or so for the presentation. John will take as much time as they need for the webinar today. So please feel free to use the chat or the Q&A box as the presentation is unfolding if you have any questions or comments or observations that you want to share, and then we'll reserve some time at the end to address those questions or comments. And one of the beautiful things about having dual presenters is that sometimes we can answer those questions or comments real time during the webinar, or again, we'll have time at the end of the webinar to address those. And so without further ado, I am really excited to present the topic for today's webinar and to be able to say the title for today's webinar, which I believe John came up with. So today's webinar is entitled Creating a Codealition, Bold Plans for Using Building Codes to Strengthen Resilience. And for those of you who care about building codes and standards, you could not have a better opportunity to hear from better people who are more passionate, more informed, and have a better vision than the people who you're going to hear from today on this webinar. And so just for context, it's important to recognize that recently the White House put forth this really bold new national initiative to advance building codes that is going to guide our federal agencies in this nation in terms of incorporating codes into programs that fund or provide technical assistance for new construction or rebuilding. And so this is very relevant, very hot topic in the hazards and disaster community. And if it's a topic you're not paying attention to, we hope that today's webinar can really spark focus on this. One more word I want to say before I introduce today's speakers is that John Gargiola, as always, has really inspired me to think differently about building codes and the roles that they can play in promoting safety, but also in promoting justice and equity. And one of the things that John has really encouraged me to think about carefully is the role that building codes really do play in promoting justice and equity in our communities and ensuring that all people have an opportunity, not just to survive in disasters, but actually to thrive. And I think you're going to hear that message both implicitly and explicitly woven throughout today's webinar. And so we are so excited about this. And with that, I'm going to just briefly introduce our three speakers today. So we are very honored, and I see that Crystal is on here now. We're going to hear from Crystal, who's with the White House Office of Domestic Climate Policy, who has very kindly agreed to lead us off today with just some opening framing comments. And then we're going to hear from our two favorite Johns around here. So John Ingargiola and Jonathan Westcott are then going to lead the bulk of the webinar presentation today, both of our partners and colleagues and friends at the Federal Emergency Management Agency. And so I will stop sharing my screen right now so that we can then have John get his screen up there. And while he's doing that, Crystal, we wanted to go ahead and turn the microphone over to you for any comments that you might want to share to help lead us off. So Crystal, welcome to the webinar.
Absolutely. Can you hear me okay?
Yes. And Crystal, I'm going to make you
perfect.
a co-host in case you want to turn your camera on. No pressure to do that.
Yes, go ahead. You can see me.
Thank you.
I'm not too camera shy.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, you can go ahead and share your camera if you so choose, or just go ahead with any.
All right. Hey, folks. All right, wonderful. Well, I am Crystal Lehman. I'm a senior policy advisor for climate resiliency and adaptation at the White House. And I am just so pleased to be talking with you all today about building codes, right? Very, very cool. I think all of us can understand the significant role that strong, modern building codes plays in keeping our communities, our lives and livelihoods safe. I know we have Fema here, and we often use their stat that $11 can really make a difference, especially when put into building codes. And we can actually save a lot of money as well. We're also really excited about the Fema Building Code Adoption Tracking Portal that shows, unfortunately, that only a third of the country is fully protected by appropriate building codes. And it really, from the conversations we had with Fema and other agencies, have really put a fire underneath us to say, we are going to have a national initiative to advance building codes, and we have. And I think the leadership of the mitigation framework leadership group, as well as the leadership of other agencies that have received funds to do this type of work and have been a thought partner in being able to add this information into those the funding opportunities, as well as other opportunities that the stakeholders can utilize to build more resilience, is phenomenal. And before I hand it over to John and others, I just want to say this initiative has been one of the marquee initiatives of the White House when it comes to building climate resilience. It does many things, but three in particular that we're just very excited to help promote. One is lead by example. For example, in the federal building stock, we're doing a tremendous job. We have GSA, which is the country's biggest landlord, as you know, and really they have set standards in new construction at a high bar that many people and agencies have been looking to. In addition, number two, leveraging programs and funding streams to incentivize states and municipalities to adopt appropriate and updated codes. I think oftentimes we are in the midst of various allocation of funds, and being able to say that when we are building better is very important to us. And then finally, orienting federal programs to current codes. There are many federal programs that have been here for a very long time, and how can we utilize this moment to say that we are going to be instituting higher standards, being able to work with partners across the aisle to really make this country much more resilient to the incoming impacts that we are seeing today. And there are frequent, you can just be walking around living and breathing, and you know that there are heavy impacts in your community that are caused by climate change. How can we make these buildings more efficient to those incoming impacts? And also with that too, I just want to give a huge shout out to the Fema team, in particular, Ed Latch and John here, who have been a really great partner with the White House to really make this move and really help move not only this program, but also this initiative, but also work in partnership with all of us here to make us very proud of an initiative that really will make a difference. So with that, I will hand it over to John, and thank you so much for the invitation.
Oh, thank you so much, Crystal. What a great start. And I am super excited to come back to the Making Mitigation Work webinars. I was checking back, and I joined you all in January of 2020 with our superstar partner, Leslie Chapman Henderson from Flash, with the launch of the No Code, No Confidence campaign. That's just an example of the public and private partnerships that are advancing codes and being transparent. And to Lori's comment about being equitable and not leaving anybody out. And the first part of that is sharing information, being transparent. And that portal, inspecttoprotect.org, does that. And I would just plug that again because the Flash team has made numerous enhancements to that portal. From what you saw back in 2020, there's thousands of more jurisdictions that are added to that portal now. There are new public service announcements that can be used. There's interactive tools that take you back historically to the building codes wherever you put an address in, as well as the disasters at that location. And then most importantly, matching your home or your building to the code that it was built, and then suggesting some natural hazard retrofits to increase the resilience of our existing building stock. So just a quick plug there. And John, if you go to the next slide, we did our intros. Go to the next slide. There's three of us. And then supporting us, also a new member of our team at Fema, Clee Roberts, is my esteemed co-lead now on this national initiative. And let's go to the next slide. And as we start to kick this off, this is what we want to cover with you today. At big level, what the national initiative is, and dive a little deeper into that, into the priorities and goals and what we're going to produce there. And then we're going to turn to something we're really proud of. As a way of supporting the national initiative, FEMA's own first ever building code strategy, which Don Westcott is going to walk us through. And then we're going to come back and we're going to turn to you all because it's about partnerships. And we coined this phrase, creating a coalition, and we're very excited about it. And we want you to join the coalition. Next slide. And again, next slide. All right, here was the big, very public launch on June the 1st. And here we have FEMA Administrator, Deanna Criswell. We have the Deputy National Climate Advisor, Ali Zaidi, along with other partners and VIPs. And they announced the launch of the National Initiative to Advance Codes at the Florida International University, FIU, Wall of Wind in Miami, Florida. So that was a great kickoff to this wonderful initiative. And on the next slide, We have snapshot. You can go to the White House in the briefing room, and you can find this fact sheet on the national initiative, which tells us in great detail about modernizing building codes, improving climate resilience, reducing energy costs, and the various ways that that the initiative calls on the federal government to do that. We are fortunate that we are leading this effort through the Interagency Mitigation Framework Leadership Group, or MITFLAG. And it's through that group where we will work on what we call the implementation plan for this national initiative. And folks recall the MITFLAG, the National Mitigation Investment Strategy, has firm recommendations to advance code. So it's appropriate that it sits with the MITFLAG, and out of the MITFLAG membership, we've created a building codes task force. And happy to say there's 16 federal agencies on that task force and upwards of 50 members. So we are organized. We are passionate about doing this work, and the process is underway. Not only will the national initiative better align federal programs with modern building codes, it will reach out to help our state, local, tribal, and territorial governments and partners and support their efforts to adopt the latest building codes and standards, enabling communities to be more resilient to hurricanes, flooding, and windstorms, wildfires, and other extreme weather events that are intensifying due to climate change, while saving families money on utility bills through improved energy efficiency. So it's not just the natural hazards, it is energy efficiency, energy conservation. All of that contributes to resilience. On the next slide, there was a great outpouring of recognition, and just here's some snapshots to see how this was playing out in the media. There's different links there, what the media is saying about this. So you can follow along. You can like these pieces or forward them yourselves. But this is heartening and encouraging to start off with. And as we're going to hear from John, Fema also is getting recognition with its building code strategy. I'm coming to you today from Louisville, Kentucky, where the International Code Council annual conference is being held. And we are bringing the message of Fema's strategy here to thousands and thousands of building safety professionals, as well as the national initiative. And they are very excited about it. We had panels yesterday and today with leadership from HUD, from the Department of Energy, from FEMA, from EPA. We did some listening sessions, but it is historic, as Crystal said, the amount of investments that are being made with these codes as a critical tool in addressing climate resilience and as a way to better serve the nation and in an equitable fashion and with the underserved communities. Next slide. So these are the priorities which were covered. Review federal funding and financing. You may be aware of a few federal agencies and grants that are affecting construction. Well, we are cataloging all of that, and there are over 100 programs that we're cataloging and we're going through and refining that either fund construction or reconstruction or repair, retrofit, or finance construction, or provide funding for technical assistance. So that is a huge portfolio. And our job is to identify those that closely associate with construction or codes, make sure they are aligned with these latest modern climate resilient codes, and just think of the impact that that will have as we implement this plan. There are other examples in the fact sheet about advancing energy codes, creating good quality jobs, specific examples with Department of Energy through infrastructure funding. It tells us directly to incentivize and support communities to adopt codes, as Crystal said, seize those above code opportunities with the federal portfolio, and utilize good tools and portals to be transparent in this space with building codes, with energy codes, and the like. Next slide. So this is how we are organized, the 16 federal agencies with over 50 members. First, it's all about the data, and we call it a landscape analysis, and it's really a comprehensive look at with each federal agency through interviews, data collection sheets, focus groups, to get that inventory of building code related programs. And then it's beyond the federal family. It's doing things like this webinar, and doing workshops with SLTT, state, local, tribal, territory partners, and private nonprofits, and national volunteer organizations, disasters, and all the different stakeholders that that directly or indirectly work in this area of construction and codes. The builders, the standards developers, the building code organizations, the design professionals. We are workshopping with all of these different groups, and that work is ongoing. From all of that data, we will be refining what we're learning from all of this landscape analysis, and it will start to formulate the implementation plan. And that's a deliverable. That's something that we have to produce, deliver, and put into action before the end of the year. So it's very exciting. It's just around the corner. Next slide. So what is the data telling us? We see these themes and buckets emerging, as you can see here. Some of these you might expect, but it's the codes and standards themselves, and monitoring them, implementing them, working to make them even stronger, right? Through the code and standard development processes. And doing that by good research and data and evaluating building performance. The agencies are telling us the importance of collaboration and coordination, and working effectively with their stakeholders. And then it's like what we're doing here today, and getting the word out, and different types of messaging, and webinars, and support that with the steady stream of guidance and outreach and training. Financial and technical, that's where it's all about the dollars and cents. So cataloging what those programs are, making sure they're all tuned to our latest hazard resistant codes and standards, and taking a look at the underlying legislation or guidance or policies, and identifying those that are already utilizing and we can point to, or those that haven't gotten there yet, and maybe they need some legislative action or policy guidance or update of agency guidance. So that's that bucket, and then putting this into operation, and staying together and monitoring, and then tracking the performance. How are we doing with this initiative over the next couple of years? What are the impacts we're making, and how can we demonstrate and show the performance? Along the way, we're identifying, this is not an easy path. in many instances, and there's challenges, there's barriers and opportunities, as well as opportunities. So making sure we identify those. Next slide. Also, I kind of mentioned the design professionals, the standards development organizations, recognizing it's not simply the federal government's efforts to advance mitigation and resilience. Our nation has some of the best and brightest minds that are working on our minimum consensus codes and standards. And this is all done by volunteers, hundreds, sometimes thousands of volunteers that are working to develop the codes and standards that we use, and that you're in buildings that were designed to different levels of codes. So this is just an example of what's been achieved in the 2022 new edition of ASCE 7, minimum design loads, associated criteria for buildings and other structures. But this is showing that for the first time ever, our nation's important buildings, large occupancy, assembly buildings, and critical essential facilities in Tornado Alley, they don't just have to be designed for straight line winds. They now have to take into account tornado winds and tornado loads. In addition to, for certain occupancies, have a safe room, but the structure itself going forward in our nation's codes and standards are going to be more robust and more resilient, and be there for communities to perform their critical essential functions. Next slide. Another very, very exciting output that will soon be published, part of that ASCE 722 cycle is the flood loads, the flood design loads that we use. And this is a major transformation that is on its way to being published around the end of this year, beginning of next year. And if you look at this chart, it tells us the risk categories. Risk category 1 is something like temporary or storage. Risk category 2 is everything that you know, even including your home or your business. And then risk category 3, as I mentioned, some things like hospitals or high assembly. Risk category 4, critical essential. But what you'll notice there in the mean recurrence interval, that's the level of design that this minimum consensus design standard says this has to be the minimum going forward. And that means that no more designing to the 100-year flood level. That's a thing in the past. Remember, that standard was created in 1968. So here are voluntary private sector experts in the fair and balanced consensus processes. We are going to start at the 500-year design level, and we're going to go up from there for our important buildings to 1,000. Another thing they're saying is that this is going to apply not just in the 100-year extent of the floodplain, the special flood hazard. This has to apply to all buildings and structures in the 500-year extent of the floodplain. And the last columns you see there are factors or coefficients to account for sea level rise. So in a similar way as a freeboard is a value, this is something that's more accurate and reflects historic sea level rise, which will have to become part of this minimum design. So this is very exciting. This will get teed up for the 2027 International Building Code and Residential Code. And just think of that along with other federal efforts like the Federal Flood Risk Management Standard, and at Fema, transforming flood maps from those binary maps to really the future of flood risk data, presenting different frequencies and different depictions of the risk and the hazard. Very exciting what's to come. And it's all happening right there in these consensus codes. That's why we pay great homage and owe a gratitude to all of these volunteers, these professional volunteers, to develop these codes and standards. Next slide. Something that's also we're seeing from different agencies and from this administration, particular Crystal's office advanced this fantastic new tool called the Climate Mapping for Resilience and Adaptation. And you can put in your address, and it will give you back the hazards that you're exposed to, the indicators, time frames. You can toggle the data that you see in the upper right-hand corner. We've also matched that with our building code adoption tracking data. And so when you're in this portal and you're looking up this hazard information, it's also going to tell you if you have a hazard resistant code. And I picked Savannah, Georgia in this instant, and you can see there population, disadvantaged communities, and below that, Savannah has a hazard resistant code. So encouraging you to go to that new tool and take advantage of it. Next slide. As I mentioned before, this is just a small example of tremendous investments that are being made by this administration in construction projects, in infrastructure, and as well as the support of planning, hazard mitigation plans, and building codes. So each one of these in some fashion is supporting the advancement of hazard resistant building codes. Next slide. More examples there in established grants like flood mitigation assistance, and also brand new one, the first revolving loan program, the STORM Act, funding local governments for mitigation activities, including activities to establish and carry out the latest published editions of building codes. So next slide. And we're seeing also where states are creating incentives and helping to advance codes and bring back down the cost of housing or insurance or taxes. These two great examples, the highly subscribed storm shelter tax credit in Alabama, and then the California earthquake insurance premium discount applied to certain buildings that have been retrofitted. Next slide. Okay, so I'm going to turn it now for John to give us an exciting look into what FEMA's portion is on that, what's been in the works and what we are implementing. So John.
Thanks, Sean. I really appreciate that. The national initiative is super excited, but I'm going to tell you some more about FEMA's building code strategy. FEMA started this effort about 2.5 years ago, which puts us ahead of the curve when implementing the national initiative. And that's somewhere where we like to be at FEMA. We believe our success in advancing building codes can be a model for other federal agencies to emulate, learn from, and adapt as a blueprint for a more resilient nation. Okay, so why building codes? Well, modern building codes provide a baseline of protection against natural hazards and extreme weather events. They save property and they save lives, as we know. FEMA's Building Code Save study, which I was really honored to present on during a previous Making Mitigation Work webinar, calculated the significant savings from the adoption and enforcement of hazard-resistant building codes. And Lori, thank you for sharing the link to the study from the National Institute of Building Science, which reported an impressive 11-to-1 return on investment for adopting the latest codes. So the proof is here. Modern codes include cost-effective provisions that really reduce damages to buildings. Disaster-resistant building codes also reduce the impact of climate change. They protect vulnerable communities and underserved communities, and they advance equity by making resources, policies, and best practices serve all communities. Strong disaster-resistant building codes that are adopted and enforced produce more resilient communities. But building codes are also personal. My mom's house is in a floodplain and near a hurricane-prone coastline. The house has been in our family for generations, and it's actually been picked up and moved back from the coast twice in its 200+ year history. We've never had water in the yard where it's at now, but it's inevitable eventually. And the wind really blows off the coast during big storms. Now, fortunately, she also lives in a community that has adopted modern hazard-resistant building codes. And so when she did a major renovation a few years ago, the house was elevated above the 100-year flood elevation, and the load paths were all strengthened from the roof down. So these improvements will keep her safe and protect our family's home. And that's really one of the benefits of building codes. Now, as FEMA employees, John and I, we know firsthand that disasters can have a devastating impact on communities. And unfortunately, the intensity and frequency of natural hazards is going to continue to increase due to climate change. And regardless of the type and geographic location, building codes are an essential and effective tool for preparedness, mitigation, and recovery. When communities adopt and enforce strong hazard-resistant building codes, they're laying the foundation for increased resilience and a culture of preparedness, and they're making mitigation standard practice. Fortunately, FEMA has been a leader in the development and implementation of hazard-resistant building codes and standards for over 30 years. We've learned from disasters, and we've used that knowledge to strengthen the nation's model building codes, so that buildings constructed to today's codes experience fewer losses, an outcome we've measured in the field following recent disasters. So it's not surprising that building codes play an important role in many of our programs. For example, our hazard mitigation assistance grant programs have supported building code related activities for decades. And our public assistance program incorporates the latest codes and standards in rebuilding projects. However, the agency recognized that more could be done to capitalize on the benefits of building codes to help people before, during, and after disasters, and a strategy was needed. We formed a building codes work group, which began the development of the strategy in 2019. And we also had the guidance of a building codes enterprise steering group, which consisted of senior leadership across FEMA. We worked with representatives from across the agency for over 2 years to develop the strategy and an implementing directive to organize our agency's efforts with respect to building codes, both internally and externally. We're happy to have broad input and support from the highest levels. The mission or purpose of the strategy is to coordinate and prioritize FEMA's activities to advance building codes for FEMA's programs and communities nationwide. Achieving this mission will result in our vision of a resilient nation with superior building performance in disasters. The strategy underpins our overall approach to improving resilience through building codes and puts us in a better position to support strong building code adoption and enforcement in the communities that we serve. With the mission and vision to guide our development, we interviewed more than 150 FEMA employees in a broad landscape analysis, similar to what John described for the national initiative. We interviewed program staff and leadership to learn how, if at all, building codes were used in FEMA's programs and activities, and identify actions that we could take to better integrate them. We used Power BI to catalog and analyze over 500 data points collected during the analysis. That led us to a number of themes and ultimately to 3 goals, which form the framework of the strategy. The goals are to integrate building codes and standards across FEMA, to strengthen nationwide capability for superior building performance, and to drive public action on building codes. They're supported by 14 more detailed objectives, which break things down into achievable activities. For now, I'm going to provide some examples for each of the goals. Goal 1 of the strategy is to integrate building codes and standards across FEMA. This will enable us to better harness the benefits of hazard-resistant building codes through our programs, policies, guidance, and operations. So while goal 1 is inward focused, the outcomes of our integration of building codes into our programs often results in noticeable benefits externally as well. An important first step in integrating building codes across FEMA is relying on high quality, consistent data sources. We've been monitoring hazard-resistant building code adoption quarterly since 2007. We evaluate several natural hazards, including flood, hurricane wind, straight line winds, tornado, and seismic hazards. We evaluate if a jurisdiction is at risk of these hazards and whether they have adopted modern building codes that address them. This data is now available in a building code adoption tracking web GIS portal. You can use the tool to identify which code additions are adopted in a given area, whether any amendments are in place that weaken the hazard-resistant provisions, and other code adoption notes. Making this data more widely available makes it easier for other FEMA programs to rely on it, as many now do. By the way, FEMA is not alone in monitoring building code adoption. The International Code Council and the Federal Alliance for Safe Homes both publish valuable building code adoption information, as John mentioned, and I'll further highlight under Goal 3. Wow, there's really so much to say about how we are leveraging our programs to advance building codes. It would take an entire webinar just to go into the details. But for now, I'm going to highlight 2 major programs that have integrated codes and standards in big ways: public assistance and the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities, or BRIC, grant programs. Ever since 2016, PA's policy has been to replace and/or restore disaster damaged facilities to the latest published editions of relevant consensus-based codes and standards, regardless of what was adopted in the local community, unless that is more restrictive. The policy made so much sense that that Congress later followed up by amending the Stafford Act to formally authorize PA to do this in Section 1235B of the Disaster Recovery Reform Act. Now, as codes and standards are strengthened, so is our public assistance program and the communities it serves. So these great advancements in codes that John mentioned previously, they will make their way into our programs as they're adopted into codes and standards. Also established by the Disaster Recovery Reform Act, the BRIC program incentivizes the adoption and enforcement of the latest hazard-resistant codes in a few ways. Code adoption and enforcement have been a factor in evaluating the competitive grant program since its inception. States that adopt modern building codes and apply the hazard-resistant provisions statewide score higher than those that don't in the national competition for BRIC. Further, communities with lower building code effectiveness grading survey, or BSEG scores, lower being better in this case, have demonstrated a greater commitment to building code administration and are awarded more points in the competition than those that have not. This program also provides grants for capability and capacity building that I'll discuss in a moment. These programs are game changers for increasing community resilience and examples that we want to replicate in other programs. It's not always about construction or rebuilding either. The integration of codes and standards looks different across different programs. For example, the new Local Mitigation Planning Policy Guide encourages the adoption and enforcement of hazard-resistant building codes. It directs planners to address building codes and the impacts of old or weakened codes during their capability assessments. The updated guide also encourages participation from the local agency or department that regulates building codes directly in the planning process. This will help code officials be a part of the broader community resilience discussion, enable them to better tap into mitigation grant programs, and help them gain broad support for building code improvements. Many of these updates are mirrored across the newly updated State Mitigation Planning Policy Guide, and some become requirements for enhanced state mitigation plans. This example illustrates the momentum that codes are gaining throughout our programs, a trend we will continue. And to that end, last year, FEMA issued a request for information seeking the public's feedback on how to update the National Flood Insurance Program's floodplain management regulations, as John mentioned, are quite out of date. The request for information is an opportunity for integrating and synchronizing floodplain management regulations and flood provisions in building codes, including the latest consensus-based flood-resistant design standards. We received and are adjudicating more than 1,000 public comments, and we appreciate the input we've received from our partners and stakeholders. Now I'm going to move on to goal 2 of our strategy and highlight some activities we're taking to strengthen nationwide capability for superior building performance. Strengthening nationwide capability starts with FEMA. We've long maintained a cadre of building science subject matter expertise across the regions for decades. These regional building science POCs provide technical support to FEMA programs and communities throughout the region, helping ensure that the latest building science guidance is leveraged to make buildings safer. While we've had these POCs for decades, we are now in the process of hiring full-time regional building code coordination specialists to advance building codes throughout the regions. These positions will allow us to develop and maintain our building code expertise. In other words, we're hiring. So if you or anyone you know is knowledgeable about hazard-resistant codes and wants to join us in helping to advance them, please visit usajobs.gov and search for FEMA building codes and apply. Increasing our capabilities is the first step to increasing nationwide capabilities. The next few examples will highlight how we're helping to build the capacity of our communities, especially those that are underserved or vulnerable. We've long supported post-disaster code enforcement because we understand that following disasters, code officials play a critical role in the recovery process, inspecting buildings, reviewing and approving permits for temporary and permanent construction, and many other activities. It's also an opportunity for communities to adopt and apply the latest building codes to ensure that damaged buildings are rebuilt as safe, as strong as reasonably possible. The Hazard Mitigation Assistance Grant Program can fund building code adoption costs after a disaster to ensure that the latest building codes are used for recovery. These grants result in the adoption of a disaster-resistant building code and/or an improved building code effectiveness grading schedule rating, both of which make communities more competitive for receiving additional mitigation grants from FEMA. The best time for local communities to enforce disaster-resistant building codes is during recovery, and the Public Assistance Program can help. Section 1206 of the Disaster Recovery Reform Act allows us to provide funding under the program for resources needed to effectively administer and enforce state and locally adopted building codes and floodplain management ordinances for a period of 180 days following a disaster. Then if further support is needed, communities can access that support through the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. In addition to what's available following a disaster, the BRIC Grant Program is another key program through which we can help communities build the capability and capacity for building codes. In addition to the building code related competitiveness criteria that I previously described, the program can fund projects that advance a state or local community's building codes. A number of applicants have already taken advantage of this opportunity. Activities like improving code enforcement, adopting updated codes, electronic permitting systems, training for inspectors, plans reviewers, and building officials, and all kinds of other related activities. These types of projects build a community's capability and capacity, and again, make them more competitive for other types of BRIC grants in the future. Now, lastly, to goal 3, to drive public action on building codes. As John previously noted, this administration is providing historic funding levels for mitigation. At FEMA, we've seen significant increases in the funding available for pre-disaster mitigation programs. This slide just represents recent funding for FEMA. And as John noted previously, other federal agencies are seeing increases as well. FEMA's building code strategy will ensure that the agency leverages this historic funding to advance building codes, among many other priorities. To further help drive public action, FEMA recently released a building code adoption playbook. This playbook for authorities having jurisdiction is intended for officials involved in adopting and enforcing building codes. The playbook provides guidance for the adoption of the most current building codes to mitigate damage and loss. It provides general knowledge on the importance of building codes, steps to adopt and enforce them, information on FEMA's grants, adoption checklists, and references to additional resources. We're also developing fact sheets, videos, podcasts, and participating in events like this one to showcase the benefits that come with better building code adoption and enforcement and help drive public action. We're leveraging our programs to share these and other related resources widely with the communities we serve, and also making them publicly available on our newly developed building code strategy website on FEMA.gov, and also on other partner websites, as John highlighted. And it's really fortunate that we're not alone in wanting to advance building codes. It's going to take a whole of community approach, and we have many great partners. Together, we're striving to build a coalition of the willing, or a Codealition, as it's called, to advocate for stronger codes, seek funding opportunities, and promote building safety practices. One example of this is a great public-private partnership with the Federal Alliance for Safe Homes, as John mentioned. If anyone hasn't been to inspecttoprotect.org, I highly recommend you check it out. It's an excellent resource for the public to learn about codes. John also mentioned the Climate Mapping for Resilience and Adaptation assessment tool, and how that incorporates our building codes data. Additionally, HUD is also helping drive public action with their newly released Resilient Building Codes Toolkit and the training they provide on the HUD Exchange. We also leverage opportunities to partner with stakeholders throughout the year, like Building Safety Month in May and NOAA's annual Hurricane Outlook briefing that John mentioned. And I'm excited to support FEMA's exhibit at the National Building Museum's Big Build event in Washington, D.C. in a few weeks. It's a great opportunity to engage the public. And lastly, I'd also want to thank the National Hazard Center for this opportunity to do the same. So that's all. Thank you. I think we still probably have time for questions.
John, thank you so much. I was doing my best. There's one question for you in the Q&A, which you're best suited to answer. It's towards the end, and it's about those building code specialists.
Oh, okay. Under which branch will this position fall, these new building code specialists? These specialists are all going to be in our mitigation divisions within the regions. Most of them will be in the risk analysis branch, although some of the regions have other branches that support risk analysis. I think technical services branch, things like that, all within mitigation, most within the risk analysis branch.
As soon as I finished that, 5 more questions popped up. This is excellent. And, keep it coming. I think, Lori, we have the opportunity to answer these even after the fact.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what I was going to say is I know we have about 6 minutes remaining in the webinar. So if you want to tackle any that are open in that Q&A box now, or to everybody who's on the webinar, we always post the questions and then also invite our speakers to provide written responses. And so John, I don't know if you want to tackle any of the questions that are in the Q&A box now.
Yeah. The CMRA tool. Yeah.
And John, do you want to read the question out loud, because I know we have a few people who are calling in. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. CMRA, can you talk a little bit about how this tool can be used in conjunction with existing tools? Is it more for homeowners or could a community use this with the National Risk Index? And it's entirely possible. These are tools that are web-based GIS platforms, and the data is organized in a certain way. I think we're just on the cusp of seeing the possibilities of cross-pollinating and layering. We are interested, I put in one of them, where we see strong building codes or weak building codes, the prevalence of disasters, and then what is the economics of the community underserved. I'm sure we're going to see possibly there's lots of documentation. It's updated by NOAA, and I'm sure it's going to be promoted a lot more. Tribal set aside. We have a tribal representative on the MIT flag, and we are doing one of these workshops, and we're sending the invite out to those 500 tribes. So we want to make this inclusive. And even here at the ICC conference, there are tribal representatives, and they're working collaboratively with the National Code Council. I didn't know that. We didn't know that. So we're discovering new partnerships with different groups, including the tribes. So we're excited about being inclusive with all of those groups.
I see another one in here, John, that maybe, what examples can you cite whereby private sector support has been secured to broaden and accelerate resiliency efforts? What has been the key to securing private sector support?
Yeah, we want to talk to private sector funders or philanthropists or foundations. We saw some of that in Katrina and Sandy, and that's an untapped resource, and so we want to bring them into the fold. We're building the catalog, we're collecting the examples. We don't have any to show yet specifically, but that's a great question, a great reminder not to leave that out.
And I think organizations like the Federal Alliance for Safe Homes can really help in that arena too, because it's that they're really able to bring along some of the groups that FEMA has a more red tape, I suppose, in engaging directly with. So having organizations like and also the Natural Hazard Center in these webinars, I think, is a great way to kind of connect the federal efforts with private investments as well.
I'll just 30 seconds, and Lori, I let you go. But private sector also means the insurers, right? And the groups that they work with. And we're seeing amazing things from the Institute for Business and Home Safety and how their fortified home program is taking off in many states and producing deep discounts for insurance on homes. And those fortified standards, our nation's minimum codes are catching up to them, right? So the resilience is happening either by advancing resilience in best practices, but then the codes catch up to that too. So just like the flood and the tornado, what we're learning about resilient roofs and building envelopes, the codes keep getting better and better. Lori, thank you.
John and John, thank you both so much. And I just have to say, this is our 22nd Making Mitigation Work webinar, which has been made possible with the support of FEMA and the National Science Foundation. And I think to everybody on this webinar and everybody who will listen in the future will understand why we came back to John and Gargiola and Jonathan Westcott and ask you both to be repeat offenders for the Making Mitigation Work webinar series, because you two, just thank you both for your leadership in this space, for the vision, the enthusiasm, the passion that you bring to this work, because well, building codes and standards in the past has been something that's sort of been this invisible force. It feels like you two and your teams and your partners have brought this to the fore. And as you both made the point, we are living in a historic moment where there is focus on this, there's funding, and that means there is so much possibility for change and to help to make our community stronger, safer, and more resilient. And just with all respect and gratitude to you both, thank you to our participants today for your wonderful questions and comments that you brought into the room. Again, we'll be posting this webinar, sharing it on the website. We thank FEMA and NSF again for the support that made this webinar possible. And last but not least, in addition to thanking our speakers this month, we want to encourage everybody to make sure and save the date for October 11th, same time from 11 to noon Mountain Time. We're going to be having our next webinar in the series where we'll be welcoming Will Groom from the Urban Institute, who's actually going to be picking up another hot topic in this series related to floodplain buyout implementation. And so we hope we'll see you all in October. And thank you again to our speakers today. A big virtual round of applause to John and everybody. Please take care of yourself and others. We'll see you soon.
Thank you, Lori.
Thank you, Lori.
Take
Thanks,
care.
everyone.
Okay, good luck, John, at the meeting. Take care. Thank you.
Bye.